Have you ever trusted someone so deeply, only to watch that trust shatter in an instant? William Carter was a man who had already lived through that kind of heartbreak, so much so, he vowed never to believe in love again. Claire Bennett, his assistant, carried her own scars, the loss of her husband, the weight of caring for her ailing mother. They were two people who had learned to survive alone until one unexpected moment in a crowded elevator pushed their worlds together. But what if that single moment, captured in the wrong light, was twisted into a scandal that could destroy both of them? If it were you, would you fight to defend what you know is true, or walk away to protect the other person's world? This is a story of choices, of standing beside someone when it would be easier to let go, and of discovering that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. Stay with us until the end, and if this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's step into the first chapter of William and Claire's journey. William Carter had spent years perfecting the art of keeping people at arm's length. The polished oak desk in his New York corner office was a fortress. The view of Manhattan's skyline, a constant reminder that emotional distance, was safer than the messiness of attachment. At 45, he was the CEO of a thriving financial services empire, a man whose decisions could shift markets and whose silence could end boardroom debates. And yet, no one knew that silence had been his refuge ever since Victoria Hale had walked out of his life, and left him with the kind of wound money couldn't bandage. He'd learned then that love, like markets, was volatile, and he preferred stable investments. Claire Bennett didn't know all of that when she took the job as his executive assistant 2 years ago. At 35, she carried her own private losses, a husband gone too soon in a highway accident, a mother slowly fading away under the shadow of Alzheimer's. Claire moved through life with quiet efficiency, organizing William's calendar down to the minute while juggling hospital visits and bills at home. She never asked for sympathy, and she never let personal matters spill into the office except, perhaps, for the way she kept a photo of her mother and late husband tucked inside her planner. It was early November when they flew to Chicago for a 3-day financial conference. The city's chill seemed sharper than usual that morning, the air carrying the scent of wet concrete and coffee from the lobby cafe. Claire had been awake since 5, finalizing William's talking points for his keynote address. She followed him into the hotel's elevator, both of them quiet, surrounded by strangers in suits. The descent was slow, each floor filling the car with more people. Claire stood toward the back, her phone in hand as she skimmed an email from the event coordinator. She didn't notice the tall man behind her shifting impatiently, checking his watch. When the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened with a polite chime. People spilled out in a rush. The man behind Claire, late for a meeting, perhaps muttered a quick sorry as he shoved past, the force of his movement catching her off guard. She stumbled forward, arms shooting out instinctively for balance. Her hands found William's chest first solid, unyielding, and then, before she could think, her arms wrapped around him. Not a polite brush or a steadying touch, but a full, undeniable embrace, right there in the middle of the elevator threshold. The world seemed to pause. William turned his head slightly, looking down at the crown of her hair. For the briefest moment, his hand hovered in the air as if debating whether to return the gesture. Instead, he let the corners of his mouth lift in the faintest hint of a smile. "Good morning to you, too. Ms. Bennett," he said, his tone unreadable but not unkind. Heat rushed to her cheeks. She stepped back quickly, nearly colliding with another guest trying to exit. Someone pushed me, I wasn't." She cut herself off, shaking her head. "I'm so sorry." The lobby noise swallowed her words, but William heard them. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket, as if nothing unusual had happened, and started walking toward the conference hall. Claire followed, keeping a careful two-step distance, wishing the marble floor would just open up and end her embarrassment. She told herself he would forget about it by the end of the day. But William Carter was a man who rarely forgot anything. At the keynote session later that morning, William delivered his speech with his usual precision. From her seat near the stage, Claire kept her focus on the slides, avoiding his eyes. But halfway through, when he glanced down to adjust his notes, his gaze flickered to hers just for a second, and there it was, again that faint, almost imperceptible smile. Claire's stomach tightened. It was probably nothing, she told herself, just a polite acknowledgement, maybe even amusement at her clumsiness. She went back to typing, ignoring the small, unfamiliar warmth that had crept into her chest. For William, however, the morning replayed in quiet loops in the back of his mind. Not the public part of the conference, not the applause after his speech, just the unexpected weight of Claire's arms, the unplanned closeness, and the way her apology sounded more like vulnerability than formality. He had built his life on being untouchable. Yet, in that one moment, touch had broken through without asking permission. Later that evening, after the final networking event, William returned to his suite to review notes for the next day. The city lights spilled across the carpet in fractured gold. He loosened his tie, sat in the armchair, and stared at the folder in his lap without opening it. It wasn't the first time he'd noticed Claire her quiet competence, her calm under pressure, but it was the first time something in him wanted to notice more. And that was a complication. Across the hall, in her own room, Claire was answering a late text from the nurse at her mother's care facility. The elevator incident had already begun to fade in her mind, replaced by the practical worries of medication schedules and billing codes. Still, when she set her phone on the nightstand and turned off the lamp, the image of William's brief smile slipped into her thoughts. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to sleep. Tomorrow would be another long day. Neither of them knew that the morning's awkward accident would be the thread that began to unravel two carefully guarded lives. And by the time they were back in New York, the man who prided himself on keeping his distance would find himself taking deliberate steps to close it. Back in New York, the rhythm of the office resumed, at least on the surface. Meetings, phone calls, endless emails. But to Claire, something in William's presence felt altered. He still arrived precisely at 8:30, still wore suits in shades of charcoal and navy, still spoke with the same measured cadence. Yet there were moments small, almost unnoticeable, when she caught him watching her just a heartbeat too long. It began the Monday after their return. She was at her desk, reviewing the quarterly schedule, when William appeared at the edge of her workstation. No agenda, no urgent request, just a mug of coffee in his hand. "How was your weekend?" he asked, as if it were a standard question between them. Claire looked up, slightly startled. "It was fine. Thank you." "Yours, uneventful," he replied, but his gaze lingered for a second before he turned toward his office. It kept happening. He'd step out to ask about the weather forecast before a client lunch. He'd bring up a news article about a seaside town in Maine, remembering she'd once mentioned her late husband grew up near the coast. The conversations were never long, but they carried a softness that didn't match the man she'd worked for the past 2 years. One afternoon, while organizing files in the conference room, Claire found herself sitting across from him as they waited for a call to connect. Instead of scrolling through his phone, William glanced at the playlist she had open on her laptop. Frank Sinatra, he noted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "My mom's favorite," she said. Not looking up. She used to hum it while cooking dinner. There was a pause long enough for her to glance up and see something flicker in his eyes. "My mother liked jazz," he said finally. We used to go to this small club in the village. No one famous, just good music." The line went live before she could answer, and the conversation dissolved into business. Claire told herself it was nothing, just polite engagement from a boss to his assistant. Still, she kept her guard up. She had rules: keep work and personal life separate, avoid blurred lines. The last thing she needed was to invite complications into the one space she could control. But William seemed unaware or unbothered by those boundaries. One late Thursday morning, she stepped into the break room to refill her water bottle. William was already there, standing by the window with his phone. His back was to her, but his reflection in the glass betrayed the fact that he'd seen her come in. "You take your lunch here most days," he said, turning slightly. "Why not go out, get some fresh air?" "I like the quiet," she answered, twisting the cap onto her bottle. "Quiet can be overrated," he said, then, almost as if to himself, added, "though I suppose not everyone sees it that way." She left before she had to decide whether to respond. It was during one of her lunch breaks that the most unexpected shift happened. Claire had propped her phone on the desk, speaking softly in a video call. On the screen, her mother, Margaret, sat in a chair by the window of the care facility, her expression distant. Claire was coaxing her into recognizing a song from a playlist, an old Patsy Cline number. "That's right. Mom," she murmured, her voice gentle. "You used to sing this to me before bed. Remember, from his office doorway. Unseen." William paused. He had been about to hand her a file, but instead, he stood there, watching the way Claire's features softened, the patience in her tone. There was no trace of the brisk efficiency she carried in the boardroom, only warmth, steady and unyielding. Margaret didn't answer. Claire smiled anyway, telling her she loved her before ending the call. She exhaled slowly, unaware she had an audience. When she looked up, William was gone. The file she'd been expecting appeared on her desk minutes later, without a word. That evening, as she shut down her computer, she found a folded slip of paper under her keyboard. It was a printout of the city's best jazz clubs, circled in blue pen. No note, no signature, just the list. She held it for a moment before tucking it into her planner. She told herself it didn't mean anything. But somewhere between the Sinatra conversation and that silent list of jazz clubs, the line between professional and personal had begun to blur, and neither of them seemed eager to redraw it. It was a rainy Saturday when William saw her outside of work for the first time. He'd come to Mount Sinai Hospital to visit a retired board member recovering from surgery. The corridors smelled faintly of antiseptic and brewed coffee, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. As he passed the neurology wing, he caught a glimpse of a familiar figure through the glass doors of the visitors' lounge. Claire sat on a worn couch, her hands folded in her lap, watching an elderly woman doze in a wheelchair by the window. The woman's silver hair was neatly brushed, a knitted shawl draped over her shoulders. Claire's expression was softer than he had ever seen it, part tender, part weary. William hesitated, then knocked lightly on the doorframe. Claire looked up, startled, but quickly composed herself. "Mr. Carter," she said, rising to her feet. What are you doing here visiting someone?" he replied, glancing toward the woman. "Is this your mother?" "Yes." "Margaret," she said quietly. "She has Alzheimer's. Mid-stage. But—" She shrugged, the gesture carrying more weight than words. "Some days are better than others." William stepped closer, his gaze resting briefly on Margaret before returning to Claire. "How often do you come?" "Every day, if I can, even if it's just for an hour between meetings." She paused, then added, "The facility's good, but it's expensive. The insurance covers part of it. The rest—" She trailed off, as if realizing she'd said too much. He understood. Numbers were easy for him to process, and he could imagine exactly how those costs stacked up against an assistant's salary. "If you ever need help," she cut him off before he could finish. "I'm not asking for money, Mr. Carter." His brow lifted slightly. It wouldn't be charity. "It would still feel like it," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I work for what I need. That's just how I'm built." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded, the conversation shifting in his mind. If money was off the table, perhaps there was another way. "I have a proposal," he said. "The company's launching a philanthropic arms scholarships, community programs, that sort of thing. We need someone to manage the logistics, coordinate events. It's a lateral move, but the salary's better, and the hours are flexible." She frowned slightly. "Why me?" "Because you're organized, discreet, and capable," he said without hesitation. "And because I think you'd be good at it." Claire glanced at her mother, then back at him. "You're offering me a job so I can have more time here." "I'm offering you a role you're qualified for," he countered. "That also happens to give you that." There was a long pause before she nodded slowly. "I'll think about it." The following Monday, she accepted. The new position changed more than just her schedule. It also shifted the unspoken space between them. Planning charity galas and coordinating with community centers meant more face-to-face time, often outside the rigid walls of the corporate office. They began traveling together for site visits, sometimes sharing long drives to small towns where William's company funded after-school programs or sponsored health clinics. It was during one of those drives, heading back from a ribbon cutting in Connecticut, that the conversation turned personal. The sun was dipping low, painting the highway in streaks of gold. Claire was watching the trees blur past when William spoke. "My mother died when I was 12. He said, eyes on the road. "My father left before that. So it was mostly just me." Claire glanced at him, surprised by the openness. "Who took care of you?" "My mother's sister." She did what she could. His tone was even, but she could hear the distance in it. "I learned early not to expect much. Made it easier not to be disappointed." She was quiet for a moment. "And Victoria." The name slipped out before she could stop herself. He didn't seem offended. Victoria was different. Or I thought she was. "We met when I was building the company. She was sharp, ambitious. I respected that. Until I found out she'd passed confidential information to a competitor for a deal." His jaw tightened. "I don't think I ever forgave myself for not seeing it sooner." Claire didn't rush to fill the silence. "Instead," she said softly, "that's the thing about trust. You don't know it's broken until it is." His eyes flicked toward her, then back to the road. "And yet you still visit your mother every day, even when she doesn't remember you." "That's different," she said. "It's not about what I get back. It's about what I can give." The car was quiet for a few miles after that, the hum of the tires filling the space between them. But something had shifted. Two people who had built careful walls had let each other glimpse what lay behind them. Neither of them said it out loud, but from that evening on, conversations that had once been all business began to carry threads of something else, something neither of them had quite named, but both had begun to feel. The new role took Claire beyond the skyscraper walls of New York. Instead of spending her days managing William's calendar from behind a desk, she now found herself on trains to Philadelphia, flights to Boston, and car rides to upstate towns where the company's philanthropic projects were taking shape. William was almost always there, not delegating these visits to subordinates, but showing up himself, something Claire hadn't expected. It was during a gala in Boston when she first noticed how the rhythm between them had shifted. Backstage, minutes before William was to speak, he stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the knot of his tie with the same precision he applied to his investments. But the knot sat slightly askew, and without thinking, Claire stepped closer. "Hold still," she murmured, her fingers brushing the silk as she straightened it. The faint scent of his cologne cedar and something warmer hung in the air between them. He caught her eyes in the mirror, his voice low. "You do realize I have assistants for this?" She smiled faintly. "I am your assistant." There was the briefest pause before he replied, "Not exactly." The moment lingered longer than it should have before she stepped back, the sound of the MC's voice pulling them both into motion. Later that night, after the speeches and polite networking, their flight back to New York was delayed. By the time they boarded, the airport's restaurants had closed, leaving only a small coffee stand still open. They each bought a sandwich and sat at a quiet gate, the hum of cleaning machines in the distance. "This isn't exactly fine dining," William remarked, unwrapping his sandwich. Claire took a sip of her coffee. "Sometimes it's about the company, not the menu." He looked at her, then really looked not as his employee, but as someone whose presence filled a kind of quiet he'd never valued until now. Between bites, their conversation drifted, not about the gala or upcoming projects, but about childhood summers and favorite books. Claire spoke of a little beach town in Maine where she and her husband had spent their honeymoon, a place of salt air and faded cottages. William listened, then admitted he'd never taken a real vacation in his adult life. "That's a shame," she said softly. "You can't buy the kind of stillness you get watching the tide come in." He tilted his head. "Stillness makes some people restless. It makes others whole," she countered. Weeks later, on a trip to Philadelphia, they visited a community art center the company had funded. After the official tour, they lingered in a small gallery where local children's paintings lined the walls. One canvas, a messy swirl of colors, caught Claire's attention. "It's chaos," she said with a small laugh. "Or freedom," William offered. She glanced at him, then back at the painting. "That's the only kind of feelings that's real. Messy, unfiltered, hard to explain." His eyes stayed on her a moment longer than the artwork. "Messy doesn't usually make the quarterly reports. That's because it's not meant to," she replied. The conversation hung in the air, unfinished, but not uncomfortable. In between these trips were smaller, quieter moments. A shared umbrella in a sudden downpour, walking from a taxi to a meeting. William waiting outside the hospital after Claire's evening visit, offering her a ride without asking why she'd been delayed. Claire slipping him a thermos of tea before an early morning board meeting, saying simply, "You'll need it." Each moment built on the last, weaving a subtle thread neither had the courage or perhaps the need to name. For William, the presence of another person in his carefully ordered life was no longer an intrusion, but an anchor. For Claire, his quiet reliability began to soften the edges of her caution. One evening, back in New York after another long day of travel, Claire was gathering her things when William appeared at her office door. "Dinner?" he asked, his tone neutral enough to be casual. She hesitated. "Work dinner." "Not this time." They ended up at a small Italian place near her apartment. The waiter seemed to know her, bringing bread without asking. Over pasta and wine. They spoke of nothing urgent, only music, the books they kept meaning to read, the quirks of living in the city. As they left, William walked her to her door. He didn't follow her inside, only said, "Good night, Claire," in a tone that carried more weight than the words themselves. She watched him go, a part of her wondering when exactly the lines between them had begun to blur. And whether she wanted them drawn again. Neither could have guessed that the next trip, a high-stakes contract signing in Paris, would not only test those unspoken boundaries, but threaten to undo the fragile trust they'd been building. Paris in early spring was a contradiction-cool air off the Seine, mixing with the scent of blooming chestnut trees, the soft glow of street lamps catching the slick cobblestones after a brief rain. For William and Claire, it was meant to be all business, a 3-day trip to finalize a major contract with a European banking consortium. The hotel in the 8th arrondissement was all polished marble and quiet luxury. From her room on the 5th floor, Claire could see the Eiffel Tower's lights blink to life at dusk. She reminded herself that this wasn't a vacation. Still, the city had a way of softening even the firmest boundaries. The first day was consumed by meetings, long hours in boardrooms overlooking the Champs-Élysées, negotiations over clauses that seemed endless. By evening, they were both exhausted, but there was still work to do before William's presentation to the consortium. "Dinner," he said as they stepped into the elevator that night. She began to protest, suggesting room service or working separately, but he shook his head. "We need to go over the slides together. And I could use a decent meal." The restaurant he chose was discreet, yet elegant, tucked on a quiet side street away from the tourist crush. Soft jazz played in the background, the lighting warm and low. Their table was near the window, candlelight reflecting off the glasses of Bordeaux the waiter had just poured. They spoke at first of the presentation, the order of key points, which data to emphasize, how to frame their closing pitch. But as the main course arrived, seared duck with orange glaze for him, grilled sea bass for her, the conversation drifted. She asked if he'd ever been to Paris outside of business. "Once, years ago," he said. "Didn't see much beyond meeting rooms." He paused, then added, "This feels different." "In what way?" she asked. "In a way I'm not sure I should define," he replied, his gaze steady. For a moment, the sounds of the restaurant seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet weight of that look between them. Claire broke it by taking a sip of wine, reminding herself that whatever this was, it existed in a very specific and very complicated context. Neither of them noticed the man at the far end of the room, half hidden behind a potted plant, casually lifting his phone. The shutter was silent. The image captured clean, William leaning slightly toward Claire, candlelight painting her features, both of them looking like anything but two colleagues discussing spreadsheets. The photo would be on someone else's phone within minutes, though they wouldn't know it yet. The next morning brought another surprise. As Claire stepped into the hotel lobby, she heard a voice she hadn't expected in this city or any city lately. Claire Bennett. She turned, and there was Victoria Hale poised, impeccably dressed in a tailored cream coat, her smile both warm and calculating. "Victoria," Claire said cautiously. "What are you doing here? I could ask you the same." Victoria's eyes flicked toward the elevators. "I'm consulting on a PR campaign for the Automotive Expo." Pure coincidence, of course. Claire doubted that. The world was large, but Victoria had a way of appearing exactly where it suited her. "William's here, too." I assume Victoria continued, as if she didn't already know the answer. "Yes," Claire said evenly. "We're here for the consortium deal." Victoria's smile deepened, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, I should let you get back to work. Give him my regards." It was the kind of exchange that left a faint chill behind, though the lobby was warm. Later that afternoon, between contract sessions, William mentioned seeing an old acquaintance in the hotel bar Victoria. She said she was here for an expo. He noted, his tone unreadable. Claire didn't mention that she'd already spoken to her, or that the conversation had felt like an opening move in a game she didn't want to play. That night, as Paris glittered outside their windows, both of them worked late in their rooms. Neither knew that somewhere a single photograph had already begun to ripple through private message threads and inboxes, waiting for the right moment to surface. And when it did, it wouldn't just be an image, it would be the match to a fuse neither of them had realized was already lit. The first sign that something had shifted came not in Paris, but 2 days after they returned to New York. William was in back-to-back meetings when his assistant for corporate affairs rushed in with a tight expression. "You need to see this," she said, sliding her tablet across the desk. An email was open, addressed to every member of the board of directors, sent from an untraceable account. The subject line was blunt conflict of interest. Misuse of company resources. The body of the message was worse. "It has come to my attention that William Carter's executive assistant, Claire Bennett, has been exploiting her proximity to the CEO for personal gain. Multiple sources confirm she has been influencing philanthropic allocations for projects tied to her personal connections. This is not only unethical, it's a misuse of shareholder funds." Attached were 2 images, one of Claire reviewing documents in a meeting, and another, the one taken in Paris, showing her and William at the candlelit table. Mid-conversation, the kind of image that could be read as intimate if you wanted it to be. By that afternoon, the second blow landed. One of the city's more aggressive business tabloids had run the photo under a headline that made William's jaw tighten. "Enchanting assistant or calculated climber inside the rumored romance at Carter Financial." The article was full of unnamed sources and insinuations, weaving the dinner in Paris into a narrative that made Claire out to be both a schemer and a distraction. The comments section was worse, a tangle of speculation and thinly veiled misogyny. The next morning, William walked into a closed-door board meeting. David Ross, the chairman, was already there with the rest of the directors. The tension in the room was palpable. "We can't ignore this," David began, his tone clipped. "The media is already running with it. Clients are asking questions. It's fabricated," William said, his voice low but steady. "Perception matters as much as truth," David countered. "Until we resolve this, Claire should be placed on temporary leave. It's a precaution. She hasn't done anything wrong." William cut in. "This isn't about her guilt or innocence," another board member said. "It's about protecting the company's reputation." William leaned back, his hands folded. "You're asking me to punish someone for being the target of a smear campaign." "I'm asking you," David said carefully, "to take a step back until this dies down." What none of them noticed was that the door to the corridor was slightly ajar. Claire had come to drop off a folder, heard the raised voices, and paused long enough to hear her name. The words, "temporary leave," and the silence that followed. She didn't wait to hear the rest. The door opened fully, and she stepped in. Every head turned. "If this is about me," she said evenly, "you don't need to deliberate any further." She reached into her bag, pulled out her company ID card, and placed it on the table. "I won't be the reason Carter Financial's work gets overshadowed." Claire Williams started, but she shook her head. "I appreciate the opportunities I've had here," she continued, her voice steady even as her chest tightened, "but I won't stand in the way of what you've built." For a moment, no one moved. Then she turned and walked out, the click of the door echoing in the stunned silence. William didn't follow, not yet. His mind was already turning over the angles, the timing, the question of who had sent that email. Acting too quickly without proof could backfire, especially if the hand behind this was someone experienced in manipulation. But to Claire, his silence in that room felt like agreement. felt like abandonment. Outside, the winter air cut sharp against her skin as she stepped onto the sidewalk. She didn't have a plan, just the sudden need to put distance between herself and the glass tower that had been her second home for 2 years. By the time she reached her apartment, her phone was already buzzing with messages from colleagues, from a few friends who'd seen the article. She ignored them all, sitting on the edge of her bed, the Paris photo now burned into her mind in an entirely different light. It was one thing to be judged by strangers. It was another to stand in a room with the one person who knew the truth and hear nothing in her defense that night. William sat alone in his office long after the building had emptied. The city glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, indifferent to whatever storms its people weathered. On his desk lay the printed copy of the anonymous email. He'd read it half a dozen times, noting the choice of words, the calculated blend of truth and distortion. There was a signature here, not in name, but in style. And he had a suspicion about exactly whose it was. He picked up his phone, scrolling to a contact he hadn't used in months. When the line connected, his voice was calm. "I need you to find the source of an email. Discreetly." Somewhere across the city, the person who had set this in motion was already planning their next move, and William was preparing to meet them head-on. Claire had avoided the corporate district for nearly a week. She spent her days shuttling between the hospital and her apartment, her phone permanently on silent. But one gray afternoon, as she stepped out of a small bakery with a bag of fresh rolls for her mother, she heard a voice that made her stomach tighten. "Claire Bennett," Victoria Hale called, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. Claire turned slowly. Victoria stood there immaculate as ever, cream coat belted at the waist, lipstick the color of ripe cherries. Her smile was polite, but there was a glint in her eyes that made it feel anything but friendly. "I thought I might run into you," Victoria said lightly, as though they were old acquaintances. "Paris is such a small world, and so is New York. Really." Claire kept her expression neutral. "Is there something you want? Just a conversation." Victoria's gaze swept over her, assessing. "I saw the news. Unfortunate, isn't it? But predictable." Claire's grip tightened on the paper bag. "Predictable." Victoria stepped closer, her voice dropping to something almost confessional. "Men like William don't love. Claire, they invest. And when returns drop, they cut their losses." She tilted her head slightly. "It's nothing personal. It's just how they're wired." The words landed like stones in Claire's chest. She thought of the boardroom, of William's silence when she handed over her ID. She remembered how he hadn't come after her. And for the first time since that day, she wondered if Victoria was right. "Anyway," Victoria continued, her tone airy, "I do hope you land on your feet, perhaps in a place where your talents are better appreciated." With that, she turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Claire standing in the drizzle, the bread cooling in her hands. That same afternoon, William sat in his office with a slim folder in front of him. Across the desk, his private investigator, a man named Hughes, was finishing his report. The email was sent from a Wi-Fi network registered to an event management firm. Hughes said one of their contractors logged in from Paris the night it went out. That contractor was Victoria Hale. William's jaw tightened. And the photograph, also her. She hired a local freelancer to take it. Hughes slid a flash drive across the desk. "Everything you'll need to prove it." William closed the folder slowly. For a moment, the city outside his window was just a blur of lights and rain. Then he picked up the phone. "David," he said when the chairman answered, "I've found the source of our so-called scandal. I'm calling a board meeting tonight." Victoria arrived looking entirely unbothered. She took a seat at the conference table, crossing her legs with practiced ease. "William," she greeted smoothly, "to what do I owe this late-night summons?" He didn't sit. Instead, he placed the flash drive in the center of the table. "This contains proof that you authored the anonymous email to the board, and that you paid someone to photograph Claire and me in Paris." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. "That's an interesting accusation." "It's not an accusation," William said evenly. "It's documented fact." David Ross leaned forward. "Victoria, is this true?" She glanced at him, then back at William. "Claire Bennett is a liability to you." "William, I was doing you a favor. You took away the one person in this company who never wanted my money," he said, his voice sharpening, "and you did it to serve yourself." The room was silent. William continued, "I'm reinstating Claire effective immediately and issuing a public statement clearing her name. If the consortium deal falls through because of it, so be it." David looked uneasy. "William, this contract is not worth more than my integrity." William cut in. He turned back to Victoria. "We're done. Professionally, personally, permanently." For the first time, her composure cracked just slightly. "You'll regret this," she said quietly. "Not for a second," he replied. That night, William drafted the statement himself. It went out to every major financial publication before midnight. "Recent allegations against Claire Bennett are unfounded and false. Ms. Bennett has conducted herself with the highest professionalism and integrity during her time at Carter Financial. Any insinuation to the contrary is a fabrication. We stand by her fully." The next morning, the headlines shifted. Some outlets printed the statement in full. Others speculated about the feud behind the scenes. But for William, the noise didn't matter. What mattered was that Claire would read those words and know he'd chosen her over the deal. What he didn't know was whether she'd believe him soon enough, or if the damage had already driven her too far away. The news cycle had begun to shift, but Claire kept her distance. She'd read William's statement twice before setting her phone face down on the nightstand. Words on a screen were one thing, actions were another. She was at the care facility one morning, pouring coffee for her mother, when the receptionist handed her a thick cream envelope. "Courier just dropped this off," she said. Inside was a letter on Carter Financial Stationery, but it wasn't from the PR department, and it wasn't a legal notice. Effective immediately. Carter Financial is funding coffee for caregivers, a permanent lounge in our building, offering free coffee, meals, and quiet space for those caring for loved ones with chronic illness. You will have full control over its operation, partnerships, and outreach should you choose to accept. Tucked behind the letter was a city permit, already approved, allowing the program to operate in the company's lobby cafe space. And beneath that, a small handwritten note in William Sharp, even script, no strings, just a door that should have always been open. Claire sat with it for a long moment, the hum of the facility's vending machine filling the silence. She thought about the number of times she'd sat in hospital cafeterias with bad coffee, waiting for a doctor to appear with updates. She thought about the caregivers she'd seen bone-tired, invisible to the world around them. It was exactly the kind of thing she'd design if she'd had the resources. And William had given it to her without her asking, without attaching it to any conditions, without even requiring she return to the company. She slipped the note back into the envelope, her fingers lingering on the thick paper. 2 days later, she found herself outside Carter Financial's glass tower for the first time since she'd walked out. She didn't go in. Instead, she stood across the street, watching people come and go. Somewhere up there, William was likely in a meeting, doing what he always did, steering the company with steady precision. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I'm told the permit found its way to you. No reply expected. She didn't answer, but she didn't delete it either. That weekend, she met with an old friend who ran a community nonprofit. Over tea, they discussed the logistics of staffing the lounge, sourcing quality coffee, making it a space people actually wanted to spend time in. Claire found herself sketching layouts on the back of a napkin, bright chairs near the windows, shelves with books and puzzles, a corner with soft music for those needing quiet. "You sound like you've already decided," her friend said. Claire shook her head. "I haven't." But she didn't stop sketching. Meanwhile, in his office, William made a point of not checking whether Claire had responded. He'd meant what he wrote, no strings. If she never stepped back into the building, he wanted her to know that door existed anyway. Still, when his assistant mentioned seeing Claire across the street earlier that week, something in him settled. She was thinking about it. That was enough. One evening, well after the office had emptied, William walked down to the ground floor where the lounge would be. Right now, it was just a vacant corner of the lobby cafe, the hum of refrigeration units filling the air. He stood there for a long time, picturing the space alive with people, warm light spilling across tables, the scent of good coffee cutting through the sterile corporate air. It wasn't about optics. It wasn't even about making amends. It was about giving her something she could shape entirely on her own terms. At the care facility, Claire read over the proposal again that night. She imagined telling her mother about it on a day when her mind was clear enough to understand. She imagined the faces of strangers who'd walk into that lounge and feel, if only for 15 minutes, like they weren't alone. She also imagined walking back into Carter Financial and seeing William unsure of what exactly she'd say to him. That uncertainty kept her from deciding. But for the first time since she'd left, the thought didn't carry the same weight of anger. It was complicated. She tucked the permit and the note into her planner and turned out the light. She still didn't know if she was ready to walk through that open door, but she was starting to believe it might be hers to choose. The sky over Manhattan was the color of pewter, the kind that blurred the line between afternoon and evening. Along the Hudson River Park, the air smelled faintly of salt and damp earth, the river's slow current mirroring the quiet pace of the joggers and strollers who passed. William stood near the railing, hands in the pockets of his charcoal coat, watching a ferry cut across the water. He hadn't expected her to come, not really, but when he heard her voice behind him, something in his chest shifted. William. He turned. Claire stood a few feet away, her hair caught by the wind, a scarf looped loosely around her neck. She looked steady, not hesitant, but not angry either. "I got your note," she said simply. "I meant every word," he replied. They stood there for a moment with the river between them and the city at their backs, the sounds of distant traffic and the occasional gull filling the space. "I should have said something in that room," William began, his voice low. "When they talked about suspending you, I stayed quiet because I was trying to figure out how to protect you and the company at the same time. But I see now that silence felt like betrayal." Claire's gaze didn't waver. It did. He nodded once. "I was wrong." The wind picked up, carrying the faint slap of water against the pier. She stepped closer, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. "You didn't try to fix me," she said softly. "You stood next to my life, even when it was messy, even when it wasn't convenient for you. That's rare." William's throat tightened, but he held her eyes. "I don't want to stand anywhere else." They let the words sit, the kind that didn't need embellishment. A cyclist rolled past, the hum of the tires fading into the distance. Claire exhaled slowly, as though releasing something she'd been holding for weeks. Then she extended her hand toward him, not tentative, not testing, a choice. He took it without hesitation. The contact was warm despite the cold air, her fingers fitting easily between his. It wasn't the accidental brush of skin in a crowded elevator or the reflexive clasp in a storm. This was deliberate, decided. They began to walk along the path, hand in hand, the skyline stretching in front of them. There was no urgency, no need to define every next step, just the quiet understanding that whatever came next, they would meet it together. And somewhere between the gray water and the dimming light, the story that had nearly been undone began again, this time on their own terms. The ribbon was the color of deep maroon, tied neatly across the entrance to the renovated lobby space at Carter Financial. A brass plaque beside the door read Bennett & Co., coffee and comfort for Alzheimer's families inside. The scent of fresh roasted beans mingled with the faint sweetness of baked goods. Sunlight poured in through tall windows, spilling across cozy chairs, shelves of books and puzzles, and framed photographs donated by families who had once sat where today's visitors would sit. Claire stood near the counter, a pair of silver scissors in her hand. Around her were board members, staff, caregivers, and neighbors from the community. Her mother sat near the music corner, a soft wool blanket across her lap. A volunteer strummed the opening chords of an old folk song. As the melody began, Margaret's eyes brightened. She started humming off-key, but with a smile Claire hadn't seen in weeks. It was small, fleeting, but enough to make Claire's throat tighten. The applause after the ribbon cutting faded into the warm hum of conversation. That's when William stepped up beside her, hands in the pockets of his tailored navy coat. His gaze moved from the bustling lounge to Margaret, then back to Claire. "You know," he said in a voice pitched just for her, "I still don't do messy feelings well." Claire's lips curved. "That's all right. We do them honestly." The weeks leading up to this moment had been a quiet undoing of knots. Victoria had been formally removed from her consultancy contracts. The board had issued a public acknowledgement of Claire's reinstatement and the falsity of the accusations. The consortium deal had indeed fallen through, but new partnerships emerged, drawn to the company's willingness to stand by its people. More importantly, Claire had taken the program offer not as a return to the hierarchy she'd left, but as a shared venture, one she could run with autonomy, with William's support but not his control. He showed up at planning meetings when she asked. He stayed away when she didn't. And somewhere in the rhythm of that balance, the trust between them stopped being fragile. As the afternoon at Bennett & Co. wound down, William found himself pouring coffee for an older man in a weathered Yankees cap. Claire was laughing with a pair of volunteers, her face relaxed in a way he'd once only seen in fleeting moments. When she crossed the room toward him, her mother's blanket draped over one arm, he met her halfway. "Full house," he said. "And no PR disaster," she teased. They shared a smile, the kind built on everything unspoken but understood, the scandal weathered, the silences mended, the decision not to rescue each other, but to stand alongside. Later, as they walked out into the late afternoon light, the city seemed softer, the air carrying the faint echo of her mother's song. William offered his hand without a word, and Claire took it not as a promise of perfection, but as an agreement to keep showing up. Love isn't about fixing someone or saving them from the storms they've already learned to survive. It's about standing there, even when the water rises. It's about staying, not because it's easy, but because it matters. Real love doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to stay. Sometimes, Life teaches us that love isn't about grand gestures or flawless timing. It's about showing up again and again, even when it's hard. William and Claire's journey reminds us that trust can be rebuilt not through promises, but through quiet, consistent presence. When the world misjudged Claire, William's choice to stand beside her at the risk of his own reputation spoke louder than any words. For those of us who have weathered our share of storms, it's easy to believe that self-protection is safer than opening our hearts again. But real connection asks us to lean in, not because we're certain, but because we're willing. Love, at its truest, isn't about rescuing someone or fixing their life. It's about walking beside them, allowing them to be exactly who they are. And perhaps the most powerful part of their story is this: even when trust has been broken before, it can return, stronger and steadier, if we choose honesty over fear. So in our own lives, may we remember love doesn't have to be perfect to be worth keeping. It just has to stay. Would you like me to also create a short, memorable closing line from this that you can use at the very end of your video? It could really leave an emotional echo. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like. Share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next journey we share together. Your support helps us keep telling stories that inspire, heal, and remind us we're never truly alone.